All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Jill Jennings-Golick, and I am currently Interim Executive Director for Community Planning and Development for the City of Denver. Excited to welcome you all to our great city. Hopefully you had a great Halloween yesterday. We have a great panel for you here today, a lot of the folks that I work with every day, to talk about how we handle marijuana in the City of Denver from a land use, building, and fire code perspective. I will let my distinguished panel introduce themselves. We're going to have them each have some presentation, and then we'll make sure to allow at least 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. So with that, I will turn it over to Kyle.
Great. My name's Kyle Dalton. I'm the city's principal city planner for regulatory planning. My team's lead changes to Denver's zoning and other regulatory schemes for private property.
Hi, my name is Scott Prisco. I'm the architect, engineer director, as well as the chief building official for the city and county of Denver.
Hi, my name is Brian Lucas. I'm a fire protection engineer for Denver Fire Department. Been involved with the marijuana industry with the fire department since 2010, since its medical legalization.
And just in time.
Is it still fashionable to be fashionably late? Eric Browning with Denver Building Department. I supervise the architectural and structural commercial plan review team.
And I'll kick things off with the zoning perspective and land use. I'll be flying high, and because I think the meat that's really interesting are what my colleagues in building and fire do. But I'll start with Denver's approach to zoning regulation and how we decided to tackle this when we were first trying to regulate it almost 10 years ago now in Denver. So we decided, there was a conscious decision at that time that Denver would use our licensing laws as the primary regulatory tool for marijuana businesses and not our zoning laws. It was a major decision right up front where we had to work together with the city council to decide how we'd regulate it. And ultimately, it was clear from the beginning that scope of operation and character of operators are best regulated through a licensing scheme rather than through zoning, where enforcement is quicker and easier because you're not tied up in property law like we are in zoning and property rights. So we decided to primarily use licensing and then just kind of have the zoning keep up with licensing as our schemes evolved over the years. Zoning has been great for regulating land uses and activities, but it's not so good for regulating the people and their backgrounds and again, rescinding permits and that sort of thing. So not only did we decide to use licensing as a primary tool, but we also decided initially not to create distinct land uses for marijuana businesses in our zoning code, but rather to treat them the same as we do other similar types of businesses. So initially thinking about retail stores, which were initially selling medical marijuana, we treated no differently than a pharmacy. Eventually recreational marijuana no differently than retail. The grow operations similar to how growing of other plants through the zoning laws, and then cross-reference with licensing, although I'll talk about how that evolved over time. One of the things that we learned after a few years of that is it doesn't help folks to issue them a zoning permit over the counter and then send them down the hall to licensing to get a license where they're not going to be able to get a license for the use that our folks in zoning told them they could get a permit for. So over time, we amended the zoning code so that at least the zoning code would align with the same locational requirements for some of those license types. But in 2010, we had a confluence of a couple of factors. So this was the time when Denver was starting to regulate marijuana, and it was a decision in licensing to grandfather the business locations that existed before the city enacted permanent licensing regulations. So there was a process by which folks could get a license if they'd established prior to the creation of a licensing scheme, which was several years after the state constitution was amended to first allow to legalize medical marijuana at least. And then coincidentally around the same time we were rezoning the city, we were finishing a 5-year process to enact the Denver zoning code, a brand new code that we applied to most of the city, following on a land use comprehensive planning process that recommended us throwing out our 1950s zoning code and starting fresh. So in 2010, we rezoned almost all of the city, and in so doing, created a number of non-conforming land uses. At the same time, we were setting up a scheme for grandfathered licensing of businesses, which created two different ways of treating folks. Some folks were grandfathered in a licensing world, others became non-conforming because they may have been located in a location where previously an industrial use, particularly for growing of marijuana, which we only allowed in industrial districts, where we might have had them zoned industrial before, but after 2010 rezoned them in accordance with the comprehensive plan and Denver's land use and transportation plan, which we call Blueprint Denver, recommending a different direction other than industrial. So they would get rezoned and have the different limitations that apply when you're non-conforming use in zoning in terms of what you can do to expand, what it means when you abandon the property, and that sort of thing. So folks ended up in two totally different schemes in terms of what it meant to be grandfathered, to be non-conforming. Marijuana businesses that we regulated through licensing had to be permitted as a number of different specific zoning use types, again, initially, and this evolved over time too, as more license types were established by the state and locally. We classified that optional premises grow licenses needed to be in plant husbandry, so again, like other kinds of industrial operations for growing of plants. Various different use types were allowed for marijuana licenses that related to manufacturing of marijuana, infusing, extracting, those sorts of things. So, taking our catering kitchen land use of commercial food prep and sales, if that was the kind of infused product license that made sense for that land use, or manufacturing for more intensive or different kinds of extractions, different kinds of uses. And then retail sales, as I mentioned earlier, for initially medical marijuana dispensaries and later marijuana retail store licenses as well. We also updated the zoning code to require that marijuana be grown in a completely enclosed structure. As just like any of the other land uses in our zoning code, we have uses that are allowed to be unenclosed and others that must be fully enclosed, and this was one where we decided you've got to grow those plants inside in Denver. We didn't make a difference, and we still don't make a distinguish in zoning between medical and recreational marijuana. But as I mentioned earlier, through that licensing discussion, it was decided not to allow marijuana dispensaries, marijuana stores in our lowest scale neighborhood zone districts, so the kinds of places that were typically embedded within a residential neighborhood, a corner store that used to be a streetcar stop 100 years ago, sometimes very small commercial areas that are along a corridor, but fundamentally in a residential area. Those are the kinds of districts where the licensing code did not allow us to issue a retail license, even though other kinds of retail sales would be allowed, a wedding dress shop or a pharmacy, for example. So again, as I mentioned, that led to us issuing zoning permits for retail that folks would then take to licensing and find out they could not get a license for marijuana sales, so we amended our zoning code several years later to conform, so we weren't sending our customers back and forth and kind of potentially misleading them or creating confusion, given that we can't do one-stop shopping with that in Denver. So I'll talk a little bit more about how those uses evolved over time, but I'll mention in the meantime, in addition to how we would regulate uses through zoning, we also had some questions that arose whether we should change the design of building form structures and those other kinds of standards that are in zoning that relate to the structures themselves. There was initially some pressure, in particular from retail stores who had to hide their product from the public and not have it available and visible as folks walked by, but we have urban design objectives along some of our streets, main streets, and that sort of thing, where the city's zoning code encourages transparency and street level active uses rather than having a blank wall along the street. So there was some pressure to consider amending that so that marijuana businesses could brick over their windows and not have their product on display, but ultimately, the city made a policy decision not to change the code and encourage folks to find design solutions where they could still meet our zoning code design objectives and operate the use. So often that means having a lobby space or something out front where it's a separate room than the room in the back where folks would then later have to go. So there are a number of design solutions that we've worked with folks rather than amend our code to accommodate the unique design challenges sometimes of this kind of use. After recreational marijuana was passed, I'm sure you've heard the story, extractions became a much bigger industry because it became more popular for folks to consume edibles and find other ways of consuming marijuana became more popular, and so we ended up amending the zoning code to be, and together with our partners, and amending multiple codes at the same time to establish new license types, figure out how we were going to regulate building code and fire code. We also amended the zoning code to distinguish between different kinds of extractive processes that have different land use impacts. That the more dangerous kinds, or potentially dangerous kinds of extractions, would be limited to our heavier industrial districts. So those are the solvent-based extractions, and particularly the larger operations. We ended up classifying 3 different kinds of extractions in our zoning code: food-based extractions, water-based extractions, and solvent-based extractions. Water's a solvent, but the other non-water solvents are another kind of extraction. Then we identified which ones could be done in which land uses and where. So food-based extractions are the kinds that would be allowed in a commercial kitchen in zoning, and then you'd get a separate license for that. Where again, the more intensive ones would need to be in a heavier manufacturing district rather than a commercial food prep kind of land use. Again, as more license types evolved, as the industry matured and folks would started getting licenses for transporting, for storing, other kinds of marijuana uses, we found that other uses that were already in our zoning code kind of had new life and were being sought to match those different licenses and the different activities of the industry. So a number of the uses, again, we didn't have to change the code, but we found that we were permitting differently than we may have historically. Lab, research, development, technological services is a use that marijuana labs ended up coming to us for zoning permits for. Terminal freight, air courier services, wholesale trader storage for, again, the storage and the transport of that. And then the last one's cut off here, but a couple temporary uses would be the ways that we would permit special events where marijuana is consumed and folks get a marijuana license for a special event of some kind. So again, we saw more energy around those kinds of uses, but haven't yet seen the need to change our code or allow them in different places than we would allow other uses in the same use categories. So I'll turn it over to Scott or Eric. You'll pick it up.
Great, thank you, Kyle. As I mentioned, my name is Eric Browning, and I am responsible for the team that looks at architectural, structural, and other building code related compliance elements associated with the occupancies. And so while there are a number of other groups and teams involved, and Brian will speak specifically to fire here in a little bit, I'm going to focus basically on building code and some of those pertinent elements. And so when marijuana was first legalized in Colorado, we had a whole host of issues associated with existing non-conforming occupancies. And so our challenge was to identify how to bring those into compliance from a building code perspective. And those compliance paths touched on the entire list that you can see here on the screen with respect to all the different codes, obviously zoning, and some of the other elements included as well. Depending on whether or not this was grow, if it was for medical sales, at that time extraction was not quite as elaborate as it is now. And so we spent a lot of time developing processes intended to provide a safe environment, secure environments from a building code compliance perspective. And so what did that look like? I'm going to kind of jump down to the bottom a little bit here, and then I'll touch on some of the other items at the top. Some of the major elements that we found within existing buildings, which is where the vast majority of these occupancies operate, have to do with life safety elements such as means of egress. For example, if you have a grow, a lot of times a high density operation is something valuable to a producer, but that doesn't necessarily work from a life safety perspective. You may need minimum aisle widths between grows. There are accessibility requirements, even in a grow facility. It's a little more intuitive if you've got a sales where you've got outside customers coming in, but for employees and operators, you need to provide those elements as well. In some of the larger occupancies, we've got fire rating requirements, especially in non-sprinklered buildings. If you get to very large operations, then sprinklers become a requirement. When we look at operations here in Denver, we identify grows as group F1 occupancies, and we even identify, well, let me mention that some folks were interested in growing marijuana in greenhouses. And outside of the zoning allowance or lack thereof for growing within a greenhouse, one of the critical elements here in Denver that pretty much put a stop to that was because we classify grow operations as F1, energy code compliance is a requirement for these occupancies. And so there are some significant challenges associated with complying with the energy code in an F1 occupancy because that is not explicitly exempt in the International Energy Code. A couple other items that come into play, a number of plumbing fixtures. As I mentioned, not only do we need accessibility, but we need facilities for employees and for customers. And then I'm going to touch on a number of the other items across the sub-trades, mechanical and electrical plumbing, and some of the elements that are critical in terms of more often than not changing the occupancy to a grow or to a sales operation. Again, we'll talk about extraction here in a little bit. So there is typically a huge load associated with any grow occupancy. Even the very highly efficient lighting systems are going to require massive upgrades in the service, probably a new service in its entirety, and significant upgrades in panels. And one of the major life safety issues that we faced when marijuana was first legalized was identifying and bringing up those existing occupancies from a code compliance point of view on the electrical side. There are a lot of existing hazardous and blatantly unsafe conditions where grows were in existence and simply just blatantly unsafe. So then there are also mechanical and plumbing elements associated with it. On the mechanical side, there's ventilation requirements, and depending on whether or not CO2 enrichment is part of the grow operation or not, there are other mechanical code related compliance paths that need to be identified by the design team. On our environmental health side, the odors associated with a grow operation are regulated, and that's something that the mechanical engineer on the design side needs to be aware of so that they can provide the appropriate systems to mitigate that from an exterior perspective. Marijuana was first legalized here in Colorado because it was medical. We created a process to identify sales facilities as a group B occupancy in the building code. We considered that somewhat synonymous with medical office, prescription requirement, professional service, that kind of thing. Obviously, things have changed significantly since then, and now that recreational marijuana is legal and available, we tend to, by policy and by practice, identify all sales as Group M. It's retail, whether they're selling marijuana or byproduct or non-marijuana related elements such as clothing. It's still, from our perspective, a sales operation. Again, as I noted previously, greenhouses and grows are Group F1. And then finally, we have testing facilities, and the building code would fall under Group B occupancy, like any other kind of test laboratory. So this slide talks a little bit to what I just commented on in terms of our change of practice from calling sales operations a Group B to a Group M. Really, we decided that there's no reasonable or relevant difference between medical sales and recreational sales. And so the ultimate conclusion going forward was that all sales would be Group M occupancy. There are a number of criteria that we've identified via policy to clarify if an existing sales facility is making any changes, if they need to upgrade and do a change of occupancy to a Group M. And I won't go into the nitty-gritty details of that, but it is in some ways related to whether there's an addition, what kind of renovations are being made, if there's actually an expansion, and that also gets into correlation with the international existing building code. Okay, and so now I'm going to turn it over to Scott.
Again, my name is Scott Prisco. I'm the building official for Denver. Some of the issues that we find are with the extraction equipment. There's some nuances between the National Electric Code and the fire code requirements, but essentially in the electric code, we need to make sure that the equipment's listed, and whether it's a UL listing or some other approved listing entity, or what more likely happens is that the contractor needs to get a third-party engineer to inspect it and qualify that equipment that it's operating and designed as designed. A lot of the equipment that's used now, especially in extractions, hoods and other pieces are custom for the function that they're using it for, so they're not off-the-shelf sort of UL equipment, and that's why third parties are used. Some of the other challenges that we're having, and I'm sure Brian is from DFD is going to talk more about the Class 1 and Division 1 rooms, but we would like to see more LED lights used, but some of the things that we're seeing is they're just not efficient enough. So we're still getting a lot of the older style lights and the heat buildup and heat gain that you're getting from those lights, which is unfortunate because we're really trying to move sustainability forward in a big way in Denver, and it would be great if the marijuana industry could somehow get to that next level of generation of utility in an LED light for marijuana grow. Unfortunately, we're not there yet. Some of the biggest concerns that we have are it's some of the work without permits. This industry, they're not, it's getting better, I will say, but it started where they're not real familiar with our construction industry. They're just not used to pulling permits and hiring architects and engineers and getting contractors on board. So there's a lot of unpermitted work at the beginning, and I think they still try and, as we do inspections on a regular basis, we still find things that shouldn't be done, and that's part of the problem. We had a really successful forum, it was probably about 8 or 9 months ago, where we invited the marijuana industry in, and I think that really, it really mended some fences and created a bridge between the building department and that industry. I thought it was really successful.
I wish we would have done it like 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah, for sure. It seemed like it went a long way. When you're handing out your business card as a building official and say, listen, my cell phone's on that, call me, email. We want to hear from you if your project's not moving forward. And we truly mean that to everyone in the industry. And I think our inspectors too might have been a little bit tougher on them right at the beginning because they saw bad behavior, and that it's always hard to overcome that bridge. But I think we're getting in a better place than we were before, which is great to see, and I think we're seeing less of that unpermitted work. Not to say that we're still seeing not the greatest in some instances. There are bad actors out there, but it's getting better than it was.
So just by show of hands, who's related fire officials, fire plan reviewers in the room? A decent amount. I'm just going to go on to high-level kind of details. I don't have a lot of time to get down into the nuts and bolts of what we've done over the years. So as far as fire code regulations go, a lot of people today have talked about medical versus recreational and putting the stress on recreational. As far as the fire code goes, it doesn't matter whether it's medical or recreational marijuana. The regulations in the fire code are the same. The processing of the materials are the same. So there's no difference between applying the fire code to those operations. And that started in 2010 in Denver when we started to, when the first license was issued to operate. And at that time, the fire department had no staff dedicated to marijuana. So those issues at that time were just absorbed into other divisions or groups within fire prevention. Denver Fires, I think in 2019 is actually going to be up over 1,000 uniformed members and 42 civilian staff. In fire prevention, we have 41 uniformed and 17 civilian. I think those numbers are going to gain a little bit in 2019. We have a staff dedicated to marijuana inspections of a lieutenant, 4 inspectors, an engineer, and a program coordinator. And those inspectors inspect every occupancy twice a year. I don't want to get too much into inspections. There's a round table tomorrow that they'll go into details, but if you're in a position of funding or starting this in your city, the thing to realize is that equipment and tools are needed by the boots on the ground getting the work done. And it is great to be identified from the inspector all the way up through the mayor this morning when he said you need to give your inspectors and officers tools to do their work. Inspectors carry radios, they carry gas detectors for flammable gas and CO2. The meters we have also track for personal exposure. So when they turn the meter on, that's tracking. If they get into an environment that they're exposed, they can have a record of that exposure on the meter, which can be downloaded. These meters, which were obtained, was the reason why we've changed our fire code on extraction facilities. They were obtained a couple of years after we started in 2010, which we thought we had the right regulations for extraction rooms, until our inspectors went in and started finding flammable gas on the floor of the places. So the meters, if you're doing a fire inspection, are key to going in and identifying hazardous operations. Our inspectors also carry grow light sunglasses, face masks or respirators, Tyvek if they need them. They're kind of optional if they want to put those on based on their experience and what they're getting into. A vanometer or vanometer, that's for measuring airflow and extraction rooms around to make sure we have velocities, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then they all carry an iPad. And what is great, and we're kind of lucky to be working in a city and county, whereas some of you may be working in an agency, maybe a state agency, you have to cover multiple jurisdictions. In Denver, all the silos of government that are related to enforcement of marijuana are all in Acela. And Acela is accessible through the iPad by the inspector. So on site, he can find out if the license is valid. He can tell if the place has a certificate of occupancy. If he's doing a fire inspection, he knows if the fire permit's been finalized and inspected. So all of that is available to the inspector, and it's really valuable to have that in the inspector's hands, especially non-compliant construction. That's probably one of the biggest things we run into is just people doing work without permits, illegal electrical. And if they walk in and do an inspection and people are hanging wire, there's brand new shiny wire there, he can see if there's an electrical permit issued, and if there's not, then he can write an order to go get a permit to do that work. So it's very valuable to have that tool in the field. So getting into the area that the fire department regulates, there's the bottom kind of licensed world for marijuana extraction facilities, growing. Social consumption is new, dispensaries and testing labs. As far as applying the fire code to the commercial occupancies on the bottom, our biggest check is that fire is a sign-off on the license that excise and license issues to operate. So what that does is it gives the fire department a check to make sure that everything's in compliance, the building's been brought up to code, whatever it was, they have all their operational permits in place before we'll sign that permit to operate. Residential occupancies, we don't necessarily have any upfront regulation. When this started in 2010, however, there were residential applications that we were concerned with, which we'll talk about in a second, and that's home hash oil extractions and some electrical service issues we ran into. So although that's not really our bread and butter to go out and inspect residential occupancies, that occurs, and it is an inspection topic that our inspectors deal with. Fires that happen due to marijuana in a residential occupancy or illegal grows in a residential occupancy, there's a task force that goes out to deal with those, and fire inspectors are part of that task force when they go out. Cooperative grows, if you're a facility or if you're a city or a organization that's just starting out, cooperative grows was a huge burden on the fire department in 2010. A cooperative grow is basically, I might have a slide on it. We'll talk about that in a second. It's basically a community garden is what it says, and it's a caregiver that's growing plants for somebody else. Typically, that is in a commercial building, and because there's no check on the licensing for those operations, we've seen a lot of crime, illegal construction. They move in and grow thousands of plants in a warehouse, concealed. So they've been a big burden on the fire department back then. So under the non-commercial marijuana, in 2010, we started seeing hash oil explosions. You probably all have seen them on the news. The way we've dealt with them as a city, and some of the issues that occurred back then was when Amendment 64 was passed, it included the term processing. When they included the term processing, that pretty much pulled jurisdiction from the police department if they came across extraction equipment, or they found that operation in progress, if they were using hazardous materials. They didn't have any teeth or enforcement power to deal with that because the term processing was kind of loosely interpreted at that time. So that fell back on the fire department to enforce those regulations, and basically under the fire code that we have in our international fire code, we use the general unsafe conditions that were topic that we could issue a summons off of, which is a $1,000 fine and up to a year in jail. In 2014, we passed an ordinance, a city ordinance that restricted hash oil and any extractions outside of a licensed facility. So if you weren't licensed, you fell under this ordinance, and what that ordinance prohibited is basically all extractions using hazardous materials. However, we made the exception of using 16 ounces or less of ethanol or alcohol based on non-fuel fired or non-heated distillation methods. That curbed the fires a little bit, but they still occurred. What really curbed the hash oil explosions throughout the state, in my opinion, is when the state law took some of our language and modified it a little bit and made it a felony to extract using LPG outside of a licensed facility. So that's when we really saw a reduction in the fires that are happening from that. They still happen, people are still going to break the law, but I think those people that are on the line of doing it in their backyard kind of are aware of the penalties now. Again, on non-commercial, kind of residential, we passed an ordinance to the IRC electrical chapter, and what we were finding is that landlords were renting out detached garages for the growing of marijuana. So they may rent out the house either to a tenant and rent out the garage separately, or market it as a house with a grow in the backyard already set up. So we were finding the energy company, Xcel Energy, dropping electrical services to these garages. And what that did was provide 2 disconnects on the property, which we viewed as a issue to firefighter safety. And in Denver, kind of the middle section house, or the diagram on the right is normally how Denver is set up. The majority of houses in Denver, we have small bungalow type houses with detached garages in the back. The overall majority of them are wired that if you throw one disconnect, the whole property goes off. So either you have, coming off the telephone pole, you have a disconnect on the house, and then you run your power out to the garage, or the disconnect's on the garage and you run your power to the house. When you throw that, the whole property goes off. What we were seeing happening was the picture on the left is that there were 2 disconnects. So if we had a house fire and the firefighter threw the disconnect on the garage or the house, thinking one or the other was off, which is pretty much protocol for them to do on a structure fire, they could be going into a building with live electrical. So how we combated this was the picture on the right, which allows them to bring 2 services off the pole, but per the NEC, that's considered 1 service if it's all grouped within 5 feet. So your disconnects are all within 5 feet. So then when they come up to that disconnect panel, they can disconnect power all at the same location to the entire property. This is kind of unique to Denver, the way our city's laid out. If you're in farmland where you have buildings on the same property that are separated by hundreds of feet, this may not be applicable to you, but this is how we operate in Denver, and a lot of our city is set up like this. Cooperative grows. So what we were finding in the early years of adoption of legalizing marijuana is that growers would move in to commercial buildings, grow thousands of plants. This kind of harbored crime. We had a lot of buildings fall out of compliance with the building and fire code because there wasn't any sign off on the license before they started operating. They can just go in, and dealing with the volume of buildings that we had back then with no dedicated staff to marijuana enforcement really put a burden on bringing these buildings back into compliance and cleaning them up after they were booted out of the building. The way this was changed was, is this a zoning code? This was a zoning code change that allowed a maximum of 36 plants.
No, it was municipal code.
A municipal code, sorry. There's a municipal code change that allowed a maximum of 36 plants on a zone lot outside of a licensed facility. So if you're not licensed, the max you're allowed to grow is 36 plants, even if your next door tenant is on the same zone lot. So that's what you're limited to. What this curbed is really the electrical loads, the building of walls, and really took down the size of the operations down into something manageable by the building and fire department and also the police department, which these harbored crime back then.
Feeling that maybe it's worth mentioning the personal growing, is that what you're talking about? So our zoning code does regulate the number of plants that you can grow in your own home for personal use. So that's 6 per person up to a maximum of 12. So let's say you did have 3 adults, 21 and over, living in a house. You wouldn't be able to have 6 each. Your max would be still 12.
Okay, so getting into the commercial growing or licensed world, guys good? The 2 major topics I kind of want to talk about is grows and CO2 enrichment, and then we'll talk about really LPG extractions, which is the most hazardous extraction that they do. And LPG is liquefied petroleum gas. It's not just butane. It could be propane or butane or a mixture of the two. As Eric said, we regulate F1 occupancies for growing and also extraction facilities or F1 occupancies. Across the country, this isn't necessarily uniform. Some jurisdictions are enforcing these as U occupancies, which in my opinion isn't correct. I agree with the way we've done it due to electrical loads, kind of the industrial use. It's not just growing and then there's trimming, packaging, and other processes going on. And then the occupant load associated with growing marijuana. The occupant load is higher than what you'd expect as a tomato farm. In a greenhouse. It's a labor-intensive industry. They have to trim their plants. So for all those reasons, we're at an F1. What that does is trigger sprinklers at 12,000 square feet. If, however, there's ways in the building code that allow you to divide your building with fire barriers, and you're allowed up to 24,000 square feet. If you go over that, then you're required to sprinkler your building unless there's a fire wall present. So we do have sprinklered grows. We have the greenhouses that have been released without separations. We have sprinklered greenhouses. Some of the issues we ran into with sprinkling greenhouses is when they grow in a greenhouse, they like to black out the greenhouse at certain times. So what that does is create an obstruction to sprinkler discharge when they close their shades. So the sprinkler system that's installed in these is above and below the shade. There's a lot of sprinklers due to that, the way they operate. For those fire officials in the room, we sprinkler those to ordinary hazard group 2, up to 12 feet. We do have growing up to 30 feet plus in Denver, basically in what looks like Home Depot racks. And those fire requirements kind of get a little out of the ordinary when you grow that high. And it's a little challenging to regulate because the standards that regulate sprinkler design don't cover those topics. So those are a little challenging when they came through. The other thing that will bring you into sprinklers is stories without openings. And this section of the fire code is applicable to all facilities, no matter the occupancy. So if you have over 1,500 square feet without openings, and openings could be compliant windows or doors, that could drive a sprinkler system. So on grows, a lot of times, we have windows cinder blocked up. If they don't provide openings, those openings are for fire department access to get into the building if there is a fire. That could drive sprinkler systems too. CO2 enrichment. The process of CO2 enrichment is growers inject carbon dioxide into their grow rooms during certain stages of the growing process to make the plants grow faster. I don't know the yield, but it's something substantial that the overall majority of growers in Denver use CO2 enrichment systems. The range that they typically keep their rooms are less than 1,500 parts per million. OSHA allows a person to be in a 5,000 parts per million environment for 8 hours. 40,000 parts per million is something called the IDLH, which means if you walk into the room and take a breath or two, you're pretty much done. For those that want to learn more about CO2, usually when I give a presentation that has more time, there's a great 10-minute video put out by Phoenix Fire Department. If you YouTube Engine 61 CO2 incident, it's a great video about the hazards they ran into during a beverage dispensing CO2 failure. The hazard is exactly the same. The marijuana industry intentionally pumps CO2 into their rooms. There was a McDonald's that had a failure of a tank in a basement, which a lady passed away from. And it goes over their experience operationally on the challenges they ran into, the false meter readings they were getting, and they didn't know what they were responding into. Getting back to the equipment that was provided, not only our inspectors were important, but once the amount of CO2 was being used in the city for marijuana grow occupancies, our first responding rigs, our engine and truck companies on the streets, don't carry CO2 detectors. They didn't. So when you roll into a scene, carbon dioxide is colorless and odorless. You can have a person passed out. Just as in the McDonald's death that happened in Phoenix, the fire department rolled into a fall victim at the top of the stairs. They didn't know why the lady fell, and what they found out in the end, that it was a CO2 leak. So as part of appropriating equipment for our crews, every rig on the street now carries CO2 detection equipment. So if they go into this on a downed person, they're aware of the asphyxiation issues. So how is it accomplished? Usually either by compressed or liquefied CO2, which is systems on the right. Usually there's a bulk tank outside. The individual cylinders is a smaller type of system, but still using liquid and compressed gas, which is then moved out into the room. Another method up in the upper left is carbon dioxide generators. Basically what this is a unvented fuel-fired appliance. So if you were to open that up, you'll see a little burner of gas. That one there is shown with a propane tank. In Denver, we have restrictions that if you're within 300 feet of a natural gas line, we don't allow appliances to be fed indoors by propane. So we wouldn't allow that operation, but we do allow these generators. The hazards of the generators also include carbon monoxide, which we'll talk about in a second. And the thing about the marijuana industry is it's always changing. There's new technology being developed. When we passed our Denver Fire Code amendments in 2016, we thought we had CO2 pretty much nailed down and how we were going to regulate it. And then a couple months later, after passing that ordinance, somebody came across my desk and asked if they can use some sort of bag of mushrooms that off-gassed CO2 and they hang it in their rooms. So constantly you're bombarded with new technology. In that instance, we reviewed it and determined that really the hazard isn't there like it is with these systems here. But constantly you're going to be questioned new technologies and different ways to do things. Why do we regulate CO2 systems? Because we fear that we're going to have a failure. These are 3 failures that happened in Denver. The one all the way on the right, we did a CO2 inspection after the system was installed. Walking out of the building, we heard a big pop and a whole bunch of hissing, and then the alarms went off. So the system acted the way it was supposed to. And what happened was a pressure regulator was set incorrectly, and that black hose there wasn't rated for the pressure that was coming into it. The one on the middle was a vaporizer failure on an exterior tank, and when that vaporizer failed, we require a main shutoff valve, which is up in this square picture here. That tried to close but couldn't, so it pushed dry ice and liquid CO2 into the building. This occurred at nighttime, so the security guard heard this going off, heard the alarms going off. We don't have these systems connected to a central station for the fire department to be dispatched. But they went in and found the problem. And then the one all the way on the left is a tank failure. This is a recent development in Denver, which we're finding certain tanks failing during the filling operation. So this is dumping CO2 into the space. If anybody has seen a carbon dioxide fire extinguishing system, this is what it looks like. So this is significant for personnel to be aware and evacuate the building when this happens. So how do we mitigate these hazards? We came up with our amendment section that addresses carbon dioxide systems. In addition to these systems, the carbon dioxide industry typically isn't used to being regulated, as we would typically see in the fire department for fire sprinkler contractors and fire alarm contractors. They're used to NFPA standards for the installation of their systems. They're used to obtaining permits. Prior to the beverage systems and the CO2, usually CO2 contractors or installing contractors would just go in and run their systems without basically any regulation, just based on best practices in the industry. So breaching that gap between having them come in and submit shop drawings like we do was a little bit of an issue that we're still working with on the CO2 contractors. So what do we require? We require an automatic shutoff valve, that one that I said that didn't close, that pushed the dry ice into the box. We require that valve to operate in all three phases of CO2, so liquid, solid, and a gas. So if there is a chunk of dry ice into it, it has to slice through the dry ice to close. Require hazard signage. This is what it typically outside of a room looks like. Compressed CO2 runs, normally we require those to be home run between locations. So if there's a tank outside, it should be a home run piece of pipe to the distribution center, and then from the distribution center into the room. We don't want tees and fittings all over the place. There was a second death in the country at another beverage place, and what happened on that one was there was a tee fitting above a restroom, which was leaking and leaked into a restroom, and an occupant passed away due to levels within the restroom. So if you do provide a T, we require detection at that location. So we require detectors at the distribution locations and then inside of the enriched rooms. It's important to have non-auto-calibrating detection equipment. And then we alarm and shut off the valves at 5,000 parts per million. There was a lot of debate when we were coming up with the code on what level to detect at. 5,000 parts per million we feel is safe. Typically growers want to keep their rooms less than 1,500 parts per million. 5,000 parts per million is the OSHA 8-hour limit. And if we shut off everything at that point, we don't want to be dispatched to deal with the problem. We don't think it's an emergency condition. The system can shut down, and then they can call their CO2 contractor to come deal with why those detectors are going off. If you're using CO2 generators that are fed by natural gas or any fuel-fired appliance or fuel-fired gas, we require additional carbon monoxide detection at 35 parts per million, and those requirements follow similar to a parking garage where you would have carbon monoxide detection, which then kick on a required exhaust fan to remove any carbon monoxide. Getting into extractions. So everybody talks about extractions and how dangerous they are, and a couple things I want you to take away is what's actually happening during an extraction. And for this conversation, this is using hazardous solvents, a solvent that's non-water based. So in Colorado, we are somewhat lucky that the state MED has regulated what you can use as a solvent. If you're in another state, it may be unlimited. But no matter what solvent you're using, what's occurring during an extraction, whether it's CO2, LPG, butane, flammable liquids, on its simplest form is what they're doing is washing a solvent over plant material, capturing that solvent, which now has THC and other components into it, and then they're distilling off that solvent to remain their hash oil. The difference come into is how do they do the distillation process. If they're using LPG, LPG will come to a vapor at room temperature, so it's easily to come out a solution. Similar to carbon dioxide, if you're using flammable liquids, you now need to apply heat to the process to get that to come out a solution back into a vapor to recapture. In its simplest form, that's what they're doing. Non-solvent-based extractions, cold water extractions, a lot of times that's a shake. It's not necessarily an extraction. They're basically knocking off trichomes off of plant material, which are those little nodule things shown in the picture, and collecting those as hash. My opinion as a fire official, rosin tech, I hope, is where the industry goes. Rosin tech is something that is a solventless heat and pressure system way to extract. If you YouTube rosin tech, you'll see some amazing videos of them just squishing out oil out of some parchment paper and a press and some heated plates. So especially if you're giving a lecture or something to homeowners as a fire official and they want to do extractions, rosin tech is something that can be done. It's non-hazardous, and I think it's a great method for them to use. It's tough we see some of that operation going on in commercial occupancies. However, the scalability right now is pretty small, so we don't really see that much of it on a commercial level. After you've done your extraction, there's a second hazardous process that many extractors go through, and that's oil winterization or dewaxing or polishing their oil. And what that is taking the oil that you've just extracted, adding another flammable liquid to it, freezing it, and just like you put your soup in the refrigerator and fats float up to the top, you can do the same thing to your solution. You can filter out those fats and refine their oil, and then do another distillation process to get rid of their solvent, and you're left with cleaner hash oil. We regulate all of those operations in the Denver Fire Code. The three hazards that we're trying to protect against during an LPG extraction are one, the top picture on the right, that's recovering hash oil after the machine was just opened up. The gas detector there is alarming at 100% LFL. Spent plant material is off-gassing in the paper bag. That's at 100% LFL. LFL is the lower flammable limit. And then equipment failure itself is the lower right. If machinery is not used right, it has the potential to come apart. The one in the bottom right is an early extraction room in Denver where we did not require Class 1 Division 1 electrical, which is explosion-proof electrical. The exhaust systems were very lightly designed. And you can see that in that bottom right picture, there's a lot of live electrical there with a cloud of LPG in the room. That operator is very lucky that didn't create a spark and go up. Also, we had problems of evacuating the room. The door didn't swing in the direction of egress. On extraction systems, I'm just going to skip forward for a second. In 2010, when we started, we believed that these were closed-loop systems. You'll hear that term thrown around a lot. These are closed-loop systems. So all of your butane or LPG is contained within them. We found out through metering that I talked about that that's not the case. In my opinion, there's no such thing as a closed-loop system. Every system needs to be opened. Every system needs to be unloaded of plant material that you just ran liquid LPG over that needs to off-gas. So if you just look at the equipment yourself, and maybe we were too focused at that time, you need to look at the whole entire process. So don't look at the equipment. You need to take a step back and understand how they remove the oil from the equipment, which is a hazardous operation, and then remove their plant material, which is also hazardous. Extraction equipment on the left, basically That's an LPG extractor in its simplest form. There's a column up top that's loaded with plant material. LPG is ran to the top and then through down to the bottom bucket, or the bottom stainless steel piece, and when that happens, it pulls all of the THC and other things with it, and then they're allowed to put that LP back into their supply tank. That's the closed loop process. This is, the picture there is a passive system. It doesn't use any pumps or anything. There's other systems which have a pump. That's right now only a pneumatic pump that's permitted in Denver, which then helps that recovery process. Extraction equipment approval. You heard Scott talk about listings. There is currently no listing available for LPG extraction equipment. There's no test standard available for LPG extraction equipment. So if you're a fire official and you're enforcing the IFC or NFPA 1, any equipment using hazardous materials needs to be listed or approved. Well, there's no listings available, so that leaves it on the fire official to approve the systems. So we approve the systems by something that we call a master engineering report. So a manufacturer of an extractor would hire a third-party engineer to submit a report to us to justify how that system's safe. The content of that report we don't specify. The new 2018 IFC and NFPA 1 have report requirements, but we leave it up to the engineer to justify to us how that equipment's safe. Once we approve that master engineering report, we want to make sure that when the equipment gets on site, that the manufacturer hasn't changed anything. So that engineer that wrote the report needs to go on site, certify the equipment to make sure it came out of the factory correctly, and he'll give us a letter that says, I inspected the equipment and it's been designed correctly. Once we have that letter, we'll issue an operational permit that they can extract. If there is electrical components on the extraction equipment, that's where we want a field listing for them to take responsibility or list the electrical components. The master engineering report is typically looking at hazardous material use, pressure safety, pressure vessel requirements to make sure every part and piece of it's rated to go with LP gas. So where did this lead us? Today's fire code requires Class 1 Division 1 electrical, which is explosion-proof electrical in the room or the booth itself. Outside, in this instance here, the booth itself is Class 1 Division 1. Outside the booth can be Class 1 Division 2. An emphasis on hazardous exhaust. We tried to require hazardous exhaust early when our rules changed. However, actual field, I'm going to show you on the next slide, we weren't actually getting velocities that meet hazardous exhaust requirements. We require non-combustible room requirements. The extraction room has to be dedicated to the operation without any penetrations. We really want to isolate that room to just the extraction operation. Doors that swing in the direction of egress with panic hardware, continuous gas detection, and we require a fire suppression system. Capture velocity is something that is really important to the design of the mechanical systems in extraction rooms. The room on the left is something we came across, which was really built as a paint mixing room. There's a hole in the wall there. You'll see that's their exhaust register. And when inspectors went out, they found LP gas on the floor, I think, at around 80% LFL. You can run a lot of air changes in the room through that. However, if you don't have capture velocity, which means you want a velocity of air across your hazardous process to capture all those vapors and get them out of the building. The one on the right is something that was tried to be passed off as a hazardous exhaust system, and it's one of the methods our inspectors use to test capture velocity in addition to the vanometer. They get a cup of dry ice and hot water and put it there and watch the way the vapors move. You can see the vapors are moving towards me, which is away from their exhaust system. So if you had a release of gas, LP gas doesn't diffuse into the atmosphere like alcohol does. It sits and it waits and collects. So you gotta have velocity across your work area to capture those vapors. One note is that in 2010, when we started extraction room requirements. The one on the left, the picture on the left shows that duct down to the floor. At that time, we required 1 CFM of exhaust flow in the room, which is something that we thought would be good for something that didn't release hazardous vapors, because it was a closed-loop system. So we did require that, but that exhaust system did nothing for the capture of flammable vapors. Every extraction room we went into, we found flammable vapors on the floor, which violates the mechanical code and fire code. So at that time, we brought in the industry into a meeting. We said, we know this is an issue. Here's what's coming down the pipe. We want your input. And the industry agreed with us, and we gave them time. We gave them a year or so, and we retroactively changed our fire code. So all of the operating extraction facilities in Denver, which I'm ballparking at maybe 25 or 30, had to go back and again at their cost and upgrade it to these requirements. If we would have known this in the beginning, we would have gone down that path. But unfortunately, we didn't, and we had to make that code retroactive for upgrade. Lastly, on extraction topics is that this is where we draw the line between LPG extraction and NFPA 58, which is the LPG code on LPG transfilling. The blue box is our equipment approval. That's what we permit inside of a building. LPG liquid transfer is regulated differently out of NFPA 58, and if you're filling your tank, that's not part of your extraction process. So normally in Denver, always outside is there's an LPG transfilling location similar to filling your barbecue tank at the hardware store. So we have these facilities fill their tanks outside and then bring the tank inside to run during their extraction. There are ways to build a compliant room for NFPA 58. However, in Denver, we have not seen anyone build one yet. It requires explosion relieving panels and blast walls, and no one's gone down that path yet. This has posed a small issue due to proprietary fill tanks and transporting between the inside of the building and the outside transfilling location, but we're working through those items. So that's all I got. It was very quick. If any of you run into me, I'll be here all night and at the police roundtable. If you want to go into any more details, I'd be happy to talk further. Thank you.
All right, so we want to open it up for questions. I was going to ask one, but I'll ask it only if there's no one who wants to ask some questions. So there's a microphone here if you want to come on up. And
Brian, you said that the 1 cubic foot per minute exhaust rate wasn't doing it for you. Could you tell us what you've upped that to?
So in 2010, when we started, all of the extraction rooms were put in with 1 CFM per square foot of exhaust. And we required it within 12 inches of the floor. And at that time, every extraction room we went into had LPG gas on the floor. Most times, if not all times, exceeding 25% LFL. The International Mechanical Code requires that if you have vapors present over 25% LFL, you need something called a hazardous exhaust system. 1 CFM per square foot of sizing has nothing to do with capture velocity. IMC, the International Mechanical Code, requires that if you have a hazardous exhaust system, you have capture velocity. And that's defined as moving air past your hazardous process and conveying them to an exhaust register. So all of those other operations, a lot of times you go into an extraction room, you'll see a pile of spent plant material there. That's off-gassing and filling up the room, and there was gas always present. So I have no confidence in 1 CFM per square foot working as a design for removing any flammable vapors like that.
So you just went into a hazardous exhaust system then requirement?
Yeah, as soon as when we retroactively changed the code, we mandated that you have a hazardous exhaust system.
Okay, and then the other question, I know in my area we've had issues with greenhouses and the darkening shades and sprinkler systems and all the headaches that come along with that. So maybe you could just touch on how you guys have dealt with that and any potential cold solder issues and just all that.
So
Thank you.
we've basically ignored cold soldering issues for above and below. If the shade's in place, If your fire is below, it'll activate the lower sprinkler. If it's above, we've ignored the cold soldering issue. One of them should go off. We have had some issues with, at the edges of the greenhouse. We've had some areas where it wasn't quite covered per NFPA 13 spacing requirements, just to the way that the shade comes down on the edges of the building. But it's kind of a surround and drown thing that we were comfortable with the way it was designed. The other thing you have to look for when the building comes in for review, if there's any building officials here or plan reviewers, is the structural design of the building, because normally greenhouses aren't designed to support sprinkler piping. So that's something that the structural engineer or the plan reviewer, when that building comes in, to make sure that you can hang the sprinkler piping from that.
Hey, Brandon, City of Portland. I heard mention of dedicated fire staff to cannabis, which is awesome. I'm curious, does Denver have dedicated like plans examiners or like people at the permit counter, that end of the permitting side, or is that something that you've heard requested, cannabis-specific staff on that end?
Jill here. So when we started this, we had originally gotten a number of kind of marijuana dedicated staff on the community planning and development side of the world. So we had someone for the front counter, someone electrical inspector, mechanical inspector, a couple positions, as well as a zoning reviewer. Over time, on our side of the world anyway, very different from fire, we've just seen an overall demand in our need, regardless of whether it's marijuana. And so have transitioned some of those employees to just be regular general fund instead of sort of marijuana dedicated positions, with two exceptions. On our commercial zoning side, our staff spend a lot of time on marijuana reviews because they are always changing something. And because of the history of where we started, we often do not have good floor plans or site plans for facilities. And so as they are coming in, we now need to get those, and it takes a lot of time. So we continue to have one additional staff member on our zoning side. And then we've continued to have, I think, an electrical and mechanical inspector. Electrical, just over time, has been our biggest issue. Going with Denver Fire, police on unpermitted or residential grows. So that continues to be a big help for us.
Hello, it's Jesse with the City of Edmonton Fire Department. My question surrounds more so on the home hash oil extractions. So obviously in Canada, we haven't experienced a whole lot on this yet since it's quite new, but it's prohibited using any organic solvents with fines and imprisonment associated with that. But we're concerned that it's still going to happen anyways. So we're developing some public education in regards with the police and the city. So my question then is to the Denver Fire Department, have you guys begun a public education strategy towards this, or do you have any tactics that might be useful to us?
We have not put out any PR that I'm aware of as far as a news release or something like that. It's basically boots on the ground, talking to people. And that's how we've got the mission. In 2010, when we had a lot of the hash oil, there was a lot of news coverage. So around Colorado, there were fire departments that would team up with an investigative firm, and they would show on TV what happens when you do. They would make a small building and blow it up, basically showing the hazards. So there was a lot of outreach like that in the community in Colorado in general, and there was a lot of press coverage. And I think that helped a lot get the message out also. But nothing recently since then.
I will note we are working with our excise and license and city attorney's office on just some basic home grow education, because we are continuing to find grow facilities in homes with far more plants than is allowed. So that is something that's coming out, I think, in the coming weeks.
Thank you.
Hello, Jeffrey, City of Portland, and this is a multi-part question, so sorry. So as far as the building department, are you all regularly doing drop-by inspections throughout the year or every 2 years? Do you have a cycle that they get inspections? And then, whether that be finding unpermitted work as far as building code or, fire code violations, is Denver finding that's having to shut down businesses that are already up and operating for unpermitted work that's done after they've gotten their initial license? And then, sorry, the last part is, as far as how does that affect the renewal cycle of licensing? So if you find unpermitted work, they're a month away from the renewal, are they going to be able to get renewed, or is there some kind of process that they can come back into code if they're already up and operating?
So I'll answer the first part. So from community planning and development, both our zoning and building side, we don't do compliance-based inspections. There's no regular annual inspection that we do. We respond either with a permit inspection or if there's a complaint that's been issued.
Okay.
Yeah, and we have a collaborative group that goes out with DFD, so when we do get a complaint, it's primarily our mechanical and plumbing and our electrical inspectors that go out with DFD, and it's a team approach that we go out and look at it. And again, it's complaint-based, unless there's an issue during the annual. You guys do twice a year. Normally, commercial facilities get once a year, marijuana twice a year. And if there's a building issue, then they'll bring us back with them to review an issue that might be building related. The other question,
The holdup of the license.
I'll answer that.
Yeah, do you want to answer that, Brian?
Yeah, so our inspectors go out biannually to inspect, and we're basically making sure that the construction is being maintained and how it was permitted originally. If we find violations, depending on the severity of the violation, it'll either be issued an order to comply, which gives them, a couple days to correct the problem. If it's a significant violation, they could be issued a summons. Cease work orders, we can shut processes down, which we do. If any orders that we issue or summonses, we give to excise and license. I don't, at some point, which I don't know if there's anyone from excise and license here, if they have a bunch of dings against them, there's a show cause hearing that happens for when they renew their license, and they need to justify why they should still continue operating under that license. So that interdepartment communication is really key, and that's why we make sure excise and license is aware of any violations that we find.
Okay, and so, sorry, quick follow-up. So does that mean that you all might have at any given time some facilities that may not be entirely up to building code, they're licensed, but they're in process of correcting it, and therefore that's seen as potentially?
Yeah, and that's really any building in Denver.
Gotcha, okay.
Everyone uses extension cords, and we issue orders to comply small issues. And it's basically up to the inspectors or the chief above them to make that determination on what's the severity of their violation and how to correct it.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
There are a lot of instances when we go out on a complaint or on an inspection, we're brought in. It's not that egregious, but it's enough that we have to give it notice to comply. So usually they're putting up layers of, some sheets of plywood to store extra material. Now they're blocking the sprinkler systems. The extension cord issue. They've rearranged the plants, so now that we don't have the required egress path. All fixable, not major issues, so it's not like we should shut them down. And so there's the 10-day notice to comply, and then we come back and check on it. So there are a lot of issues that are not, I would say, urgent or eminent life safety issues, but are really important that we want to get fixed. And that happens to a large number of, properties where we do an inspection.
All right, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
And we're right at time, so maybe we'll take one last quick question.
One last question? Okay, well, I actually had a few, but
You have to put them all in one sentence continually.
I'll go really fast. Really, for the planning and zoning, I'm Rick, I'm from California. What does it take to go from the entitlement stage to the C of O stage? About how long does it take for somebody to get through the process?
Goodness, does anybody know?
You could start.
Well, I mean, we're pretty much not dealing with.
Okay, so
Go ahead.
Yeah. So if you're
year,
talking about
6 months, 10
a new build, or you're
If somebody comes in and says, hey, I want to do cannabis, I want to do dispensary, how long does it take from that point when they say, I want to be in business, to get to a C of O?
okay? So they're
Is
going to
that
enter into
a
a
year,
site
a year
development.
and a half?
Yeah. So they're going to enter into our site development plan process, which there's a concept review and submission that happens. That's free, so that you're not investing a lot of money to see if this makes sense. Can it happen? So the zoning team will look at it and they'll say, yes, it looks from a zoning perspective, you could do this, almost back of a napkin kind of stuff to see, so there's not a big outlay of capital. At that point, then they'll say, okay, you're approved to go into your final. And then once you're partway through your final, you submit for building permit at that point. And then you go through all of the reviews that Eric mentioned earlier. So the site development process can really vary. It can be a 3-month window, or it could be a 1-year window, depending on how quick they're getting back to us on things. The site development team, they're actually helping the project coordinators, and there are other things, obviously, like any project, like transportation, forestry, public works, all of those other components that might enter into your project. When you enter the site development plan process, believe it or not, there are 54 touches from different agencies, whether in Denver or Xcel Energy, and so there's 54 potential touches. So that's why we don't never know if it's 3 months to 12 months, depending on how complicated the project is and how responsive your architectural engineering team is coming back when we have comments. Best case scenario, if you're looking at a brand new build, you're going to get through and probably start the building permitting process at about 2.5 months, probably at best case scenario, and then you're going to be in our world for about 2 to 3 months, realistically. So you're probably looking best case scenario 6 months, walk in the door, to under construction, and then the duration of construction.
Okay. The last one I want to ask is, you guys have been doing this for a while. I'm just wondering, is there any ongoing data collection, reporting, things you guys do, metrics you're looking at, so that you have some lessons learned? And does that happen on a regular basis? Or how are you guys improving on this?
We're continually improving on all of ours. Acela, the program that we use, it's sort of a love-hate relationship. We really hated it at the beginning we first implemented. It was really challenging. Went from a really simple system to a really complicated system. In Denver, we probably overcomplicated it as well, so it got that much more complex. But we've gotten it down to a really good point now, and we're working well with our technology services department, so we're getting much happier with Acela. But the great part about Acela is we're able to capture almost everything that happens. We have every workflow, the metrics on everything, and every Monday we meet, and we know how many widgets we should have put out and how many we put out in every single work group, which is great. And we're making improvements continually with that data.
But for those of us that are visiting here, is there some sort of a publication that the city puts out that says, hey, here's our marijuana or our cannabis report
Excise
for the
and-
year, so we could take it and we could say, okay, here's the things that they're learning year after year after year
Excise
to
and
make
license
themselves better?
records those statistics.
Okay.
And there's a pamphlet that they put out that goes through revenue, number of licenses, and all those statistics.
Excise and- okay.
So if you talk to someone from Excise and License, they track all that, and they put out an annual publication. That does not get into building and fire permitting to that detail. But to talk about your issue is, are we changing stuff? One of the outcomes of Acela is that we can track the number of reviews on a project. Correct me if I'm wrong, but if we see that a project has been rejected 4 or more times, I think the policy is to pull in the design team and ask them what's going wrong with the process. And that's building department wide and not specific to marijuana.
Great, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.